Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, David Christopher Kaufman. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. I've been following your writing for some time, and you and I have talked before, but it's good that we can now record a conversation for posterity. I think the people need it. There's a lot I want to talk to you about on some of the issues you've been writing about. Some listeners will know that you write for the New York Post, you write for the Tablet, you write for the Telegraph and the Spectator over here. You've got your fingers in lots of pies. And one of the things I find most interesting about you is that your mixed heritage is both African-American and Jewish. So you come at some of the questions of our time in such an interesting way. So I want to dig into all of that with you today. But I guess I want to kick off with a broad question about what's going on in America. And you've had this a new boss for a few weeks now, and he's certainly stirring up a storm on many, many issues right now on Ukraine. But prior to that, on DEI, on men in women's sports, on the whole apparatus of the American bureaucracy, all of it's been shaken up by Trump and his team. What's America like now? Does it feel new? Does it feel different? What's the vibe?
Yeah, I mean, it completely feels different. And as you said, I'm an editor and columnist at the New York Post. That's my day job, and I write for all these other publications as well. But here at the New York Post, it just feels like the news cycle that already was crazy is just never ending. It sort of feels like a new dawn in America. We can debate whether or not we support that new dawn, but the dawn has arrived. It's here. Whether it's Ukraine, whether it's DEI, whether it's transgender issues, whether it's Social Security, whether it's the reform of the education system. I think that for me, what's most interesting, especially on sort of what we would call culture war or social issues. For instance, Trump today was talking about defunding any university that tolerates anti-Semitism, his whole approach to Gaza and Israel. Is that even if you don't necessarily agree with Donald Trump and the way he views the world and his approach to things, he's made it clear that, business as usual is done. The way things were done under 4 years of Biden and Kamala, and then sort of the previous Democratic administration of Obama for 8 years, that period is over. And what's most telling is the folks that sort of benefited from that or were sort of and so invested in that are really kicking and screaming. I mean, they don't want this period to end. They talk about the resistance. And I think that they feel like they're very much under attack, and they are under attack, and I think in some ways for good reason. I mean, I tend to skew more centrist and sort of left than a lot of my colleagues here at the New York Post, even though I would consider myself a pragmatist. But there was a lot of overreach in terms of identity politics, obviously in terms of Israel and anti-Semitism. And I think what Trump has said is that this will no longer be tolerated, or if it is going to be tolerated in some form, it needs to be justified. I think one of the big issues around the previous administration and also leading back to the Obama years was that there was no real sense of why these things were tolerated, why sort of there was like an endless embrace of identity politics, endless embrace of transgender rights or procedures for children who might be diagnosed as gender dysphoric, all of the culture war totems that we have talked about, we will speak about. But generally, there was never a real sense of why is this being tolerated? Why is the overreach so extreme without any pushback? Why is nobody allowed to question this? And I think what Donald Trump is saying in a very vocal and very, in some ways, extreme way, but not in a surprising way. He said this all throughout his campaign. Nothing he's done is surprising. What he's saying is that we are no longer going to tolerate the unquestioned reach of the extreme left. And that the extreme left needs to sort of justify its existence right now, why they are doing things. What's so interesting, I think, about especially the DEI question is that DEI is one of these, ideologies that is, infiltrated every element of American society, but there's no real benchmarks for if it works, and you can see that Trump is that whole way of thinking of asking, are things working? Are there results? Is there a positive outcome? Is there a payback? Donald Trump is asking that about everything, whether it's the budget, whether it's about foreign aid, or whether it's about, race-based preferences. He wants to know, what is the takeaway? Is it working? How are we measuring success? I think what's so challenging for the far left right now is nobody has ever asked them to actually demonstrate how they are, if they're succeeding or how they're succeeding. What does success look like to them? If we're pouring billions of dollars into DEI, what is the success? What are the markers of accomplishment? And Donald Trump is saying, you all now need to show that you're actually accomplishing something with all this money, time, and attention that you are, sucking from the American culture and government. And the far left is really unhappy about that.
Yeah, that's a really good way to describe, I think, the first few weeks of the second Trump administration. And I feel similarly, because sometimes I see things that Trump is doing and I think, oh, I really think that's good. I think it's good that he signed an executive order forbidding men from taking part in women's sports. I think that's good for women. That's good for girls. I think he's calling into question DEI is good. I think that's good. Then he does other stuff and I think this is crazy. So I don't like what he's doing on Ukraine, for example. I think he's being reckless on Ukraine, and I think he's not thinking carefully about America's geopolitical interests. But you're right that it kind of doesn't matter if you like this or dislike that. The point is that more broadly, he is shaking things up, and he was elected to shake things up. That is what people wanted him to do. And what do you think? Because we often see from here in Britain, so we're watching from a distance, we will often see a lot of media hand-wringing over Trump and calling him crazy, and he's doing this crazy thing, that crazy thing. What is the American electorate's perspective, especially, I guess, Trump voters? Are they satisfied with what he's doing so far?
I think it's just too soon to tell, to be honest with you. But I would say, for the most part, people who voted for Trump are happy with what Trump's doing so far, for the most part. I do think that folks were fed up with sort of carte blanche antics of the previous administration. People were fed up with the feeling that we didn't have a government. When I watched Trump week one walking through North Carolina with Melania, going to visit hurricane victims, they hadn't received help from the government for weeks. Whether or not I voted for Trump, my first response was, wow, it looks like we finally have a president again. Biden and Kamala really, really, really sort of, there was this massive power vacuum for the last 6 months of the Biden administration. And we saw what happened in that power vacuum. And there was a sense that nobody was manning the kitchen. Nobody was at the White House. Who was running the government? I mean, it says something when you feel, as a citizen of the United States of America, the largest and really the most important country in the world with the most geopolitical influence, that we were lacking a functional government, that nobody knew who was in charge. I mean, that in itself just sort of shows the failure of Kamala and Biden. And not just a failure, but when I was watching Trump inaugurated, my only response was, how did this happen? How did the Democrats allow this man to get reelected again? And they had years and years and years to plan for the next phase. That we knew that he was always in the shadows. We knew that Trumpism was something a lot bigger than Trump. And still, he was reelected. So I'm, as much as I have a lot of points of view, ideologies, personal investment in many of the issues that progressives champion, I also feel like we got the president we voted for. I get a little fed up with my mom's a big super duper liberal lefty, and she's like on my case calling me a Trumper, and I'm like, Mom, your side failed. You had every opportunity to get a candidate in office that of your choosing, and you failed. Not just you failed spectacularly on every single account. And so this is what happened. Trump is reelected. Stop complaining. Start thinking about, instead of bemoaning the fact that he's in office, think about, focus forward, focus to the next 4 years. If you don't like him in office or his people, what are you going to do to get him out? But we got the president in the United States that the United States voted for. This is the system. Democracy worked. Democracy does not only work when your candidate is elected.
I think, the thing that's become clear over the past few weeks of Trump 2.0, and I'm sure it's been clear to many Americans for much longer than this, but to me, it's become clear that America had this vast bureaucracy with billions of dollars that it was spending, often on things that had not been tested, as you say, and whose worth had not been proven in any meaningful way. DEI is a good example. It was also funding lots of crazy things around the world, including charities here in Britain and other parts of the world too. So it had this huge machinery of state, but it didn't necessarily have a political leader. Biden was not a real political leader, and we now know it's come out that our suspicions that he was incredibly frail and not running the show have been proven correct. Kamala was not a good leader and was rushed in at the last minute to stand in Biden's place. So is that your impression from all the revelations we've seen with Doge and other stuff over the past few weeks, that America just became this huge, massive state machine, but there was really no one in charge, or at least we didn't really know who was in charge?
In some ways, I think it's because you're such a clever and intelligent man. I think in some ways we're almost overthinking it. I think what it was, you saw how Trump was elected now. You had this broad coalition, this sort of rainbow coalition of voters. You had vast numbers of African Americans, vast numbers of Latinos, a large number of women, all of whom voted in almost unprecedented numbers for a Republican. Like something like 40% of all Black men under 40 voted for Trump. When there was an African American candidate running against him. So the only minority group in America who didn't support Trump more this year, this cycle than the previous cycle were LGBTs. So I think what it was there was what we're seeing now is revelations of this vast amoeba-like, octopus-like, squid-like entity that was sucking up and dispersing billions of dollars with no accountability. But I think what it was all of these voters kind of had this inkling after a certain point that whatever's happening in this country right now is just not working. It's not working for me, or it doesn't speak for me. And I think a lot there's this idea that Black voters will automatically vote for a Black candidate, and it's like, why would they automatically vote for a Black candidate, especially a Black candidate like Kamala, who was such a problematic African-American candidate and really, aroused so many suspicions about her African-Americanness. You had all these issues around Latinos. You saw a tremendous number of Latins who arrived here legally over the course of the last, 20 or 30 years. They were the most vocal anti-immigration cohort. They did not want illegal Latin American immigrants coming from Latin America. They wanted them to pay their dues like they did. So all of these folks might not have said to themselves, there's this vast monster in Washington that's, wasting all of our money, but they probably had some inkling that monster existed in some form and just wasn't serving the nation the way it's supposed to. And now, 5 weeks into the administration, we're seeing not only was this monster, this vast amoeba-like structure, not functioning and not really doing the job of government, but it was also wasting billions and billions of dollars at a time when Americans have never needed their money more. I mean, we're living in a highly inflationary situation right now. The cost of living is extremely high. Unemployment is stable-ish, but who knows, and problematic. So people are really feeling it in their pocketbooks, and they're struggling, and so I think that I think what it really was this suspicion that there was something out there on a grand scheme that was not working. It was sort of hidden and camouflaged by all of this kind of progressive language around identity and this and that. But really, folks were like, we've had enough, and we don't believe it. And I think one of the key things, the reasons why Kamala did not win, is that she failed to really make voters believe her. She didn't feel authentic. She didn't feel like you really knew what she stood for at a moment when people were so distrusting of the government. She failed to sort of engender any sort of trust. I mean, over and over again, I was waiting for her to speak to me and and sort of cultivate a sense of trust in her. And I just didn't. I'm not saying I had a sense of trust in Trump, but I didn't have it in Kamala at all, especially considering that she came from an administration that had basically lied to the American people over and over again.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I have some exciting news to share with you. This year, Spiked is celebrating its 25th birthday. 25 years ago, Spiked was a pioneer of online political journalism, and now we are bigger than ever. We're reaching people around the world with our articles, essays, videos, and podcasts, all underpinned by our principled message of freedom, democracy, and progress. This would never have happened without you, our listeners, readers, and supporters. Your donations fund our work, and your enthusiasm spreads the word about it. So as we mark Spike's 25th birthday, we want to say a heartfelt thank you. And we're asking those who can afford it to donate to our anniversary appeal in order to keep Spiked going and growing into the future. We also have a very special offer on at the moment. Those who donate £25 or more will get a year's membership to Spike Supporters, our online donor community where you can comment on articles, come to events, and read the site ad-free. This is half of what you'd normally pay for a year's membership. And if you're already a Spike supporter, you can benefit from this offer too. Just make a donation of £25 or more and we'll extend your membership by 12 months. So if you want to support Spiked and get access to some brilliant exclusive perks, go to spiked-online.com/donate. That's spiked-online.com/donate and donate £25 or more to help keep us going for another 25 years. Now, on with the show. Absolutely. Every time I saw Kamala Harris, I just thought, well, who are you? What are you all about? And I'm sure Americans must have felt that even more strongly because they were being asked to give her their vote. So it must have aroused that question in their minds. The way you're talking, it makes me think America is having a reckoning with itself. And sometimes that reckoning is going to produce good results. And sometimes it might be a bit more chaotic. But I think having a reckoning with oneself is a good thing, generally speaking. I hope Britain has a reckoning with itself at some point too. But I wonder, I did want to ask you, you've already touched on Trump's actions in relation to anti-Semitism on campus. And it feels to me that one of the reckonings that America needs to have, and the West more broadly, is with what happened in our societies after 7th of October. And this is something that you've written about really, really insightfully over the past year and a half or more. As I said earlier, you often come at it from your mixed heritage background, African-American, but also Jewish heritage too. And that really gives a fascinating insight in how these different identities and different racisms play out in the United States in particular. So to kick off this side of the discussion, I guess, I mean, there's one thing that you wrote very soon after 7th of October, I think for the tablet, about your two identities and how that gave you felt that gave you an insight into the moral meltdown that was taking place in the US after 7th of October and the return of a very old form of hatred. Give us a sense of what it was like in the US after 7th of October, what you saw, what you witnessed.
I mean, it was shocking. I'm not a crier, but my children saw me cry for the first time ever after October 7th. It was highly personal and highly, highly painful. What was so, I'm what you would call like a cliche accidental activist. I was internally political, but not externally political. People knew who I was. They knew what I was about. They knew where I came from. But after October 7th, it was so hard for me to see immediately, we're talking about the next day, if not the same day, to see people of color, to see African-American groups, to see LGBT groups marching down the streets, championing Hamas, championing the wanton bloodshed of Jews and Israelis, and justifying it. This was the part that was most horrific to me, justifying it under the banners of intersectionality, under the banners of shared struggle and shared identity, or what I call movement mooching, when movements mooch off each other for no reason. So they were basically, championing the killing and murder and extermination of one half of me, the Jewish side, using my Black side to justify it. And I was just sort of like, this is unacceptable. This is immoral. And this is wrong. This could not be more historically and morally wrong and bankrupt and intolerable. And also what I saw was and this is what I've seen every single day since then. The thing that makes me the most angry every single day is that there is a fundamental. I've been to Israel many, many times now since October 7th. And one of the things I realize when I'm in Tel Aviv or I'm in Israel is that if Hamas had their way, they would kill or kidnap or rape or kill, kidnap, and rape every single person that I see in front of me right now. Every single person they would want to do some form of horrific violence to. And so what I think what I call the bad guys, which is basically the amalgam of pro-Palestinian protesters and the pro-Gaza crowd and the Hamas apologists, and of course Hamas and all of them, is that there's a fundamental unwillingness to understand, to acknowledge, to accept the actual risk that's in front of us, the peril, which is that there is a movement led by Hamas and Islamic fundamentalism and anti-Zionism, in many ways anti-Westernism, that wants to kill Jews. That is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to kill people like me, to kill my children, to kill my family, to kill my friends. When people say they want to kill me, I take that very seriously. I'm not thinking like, oh, let's talk about it and like sort of, have like a drum circle to make things better. No, you want to kill me. Not only do you want to kill me, you've already killed people like me. And if I had been there that day, you probably would have killed me too. And you said you're going to do it again. So that's where everything begins for me. And what I wrote about in that tablet piece early on was one of the reasons I am so believing of Hamas, and I believe so much that they want to kill me, is that because I'm also Black, I've lived my whole life with racism. So I know, I think a lot of American Jews, it's very hard for them to really accept the fact that, like, despite them being nice people who, treat their families well and treat their neighbors well and give to charity and are philanthropic and are good American citizens, it's really hard for most American Jews, I think, to really understand that there's a world out there that wants their death and destruction simply because they're Jewish, and there's nothing they can do about it. They cannot change their minds. But as a Black person who's grown up with racism my whole life, that's been the reality of my whole life. I understand that there are people out there who hate me for the color of my skin, and there's nothing I can do about it. I cannot make them like me. I cannot make them less racist. I mean, maybe I can, but I don't have the time. But the point is like, I intuitively understand how this system works. So when I, on October 8th, was seeing what had happened in southern Israel, in Gaza, and then around the world, I immediately understood it, both as a Jewish person and as a Black person. As I wrote, I understand. Because I am Black, I understand that Hamas wants to kill me because I'm a Jew. So, and also what has become so frustrating for me, and what sort of powers so much of my work, is this question of like, why do we live in a system and society in the United States and around the world that it's so invested in affirming and honoring and investing in and interrogating and all the buzzwords that the Academy likes to use. Discrimination against, say, Black people or LGBT people, but refuses in any way whatsoever to acknowledge discrimination against Jews, despite the fact that Jews are the most discriminated minority in America right now, despite the fact that, like, we face a violent, the threat against Jews, the protesters, these are extremely violent people. There's nothing kind of like warm and fuzzy about these people. It's a movement that is rooted in violence. These are violent, aggressive, destructive people who want to, barf that violence, destruction, and aggression onto Jews and hurt them, or prevent them from going to school, or prevent them from earning a living. Things that would never be tolerated for Black people or for gay people or for Asian people. Yet somehow, not only is it tolerated, if not encouraged in the United States right now and around the world, but Jews are blamed for it. We are blamed and held accountable and expected to atone and explain our own discrimination.
And as you should be, full of rage about this stuff. You've described very well there what happened in America after 7th of October. And it happened in Europe as well, and in Australia, in Britain, outside the Israeli embassy in London on the 9th of October. This is about 36 hours after the pogrom. people were celebrating. They were dancing in the streets. They were playing pop music. They were lighting fireworks. They were celebrating a modern day Jew hunt that Hamas had carried out outside the Sydney Opera House. We saw people gathering on the 9th of October and saying, fuck the Jews, apparently gas the Jews as well, but really anti-Jewish invective on the streets of Sydney, a civilized city like Sydney on 9th of October. So it was a global phenomenon, what you describe as happening in the US as well. And you've described well what happened, but I want to ask you why it happened, or I guess how it could happen, because you know what people say, and you're as skeptical of this as I am, but people will say, well, we were protesting against Israel. We were just, even though by that point, Israel had not meaningfully responded to Hamas's attack. So it kind of doesn't even stack up at a practical level. But they will say these are anti-Israel protests. These are not anti-Semitic protests. We're anti-Zionist, we're not anti-Semitic. I mean, that is the response they always give. What's your view on when people say that?
Or the horror of that statement is that when it turns to Jews, the end game is usually Jews are killed in a large, this an attempt at mass extermination of Jews, often supported by governmental or military institutions, aka Hamas. So history shows over and over again what happens when these systems are put in place. Yet somehow this system was allowed to infiltrate every element of American society without questioning, well, what's going to happen if, God forbid, there's an outburst of anti-Semitism? In fact, the idea was, it's not even possible because the Jews are all right. Well, Jews have often been all right in history. They were all right in Weimar Germany during the interwar period. In many ways, Jews were all right in the court of Isabella and Ferdinand in the late 15th century, but suddenly they weren't all right. And suddenly we saw millions of Jews expelled from Iberia and millions of Jews exterminated in concentration camps. So this is like what's so frustrating. And now we have a situation where, this system of, racial preferences, DEI, CRT, whatever you want to call it, is sort of has failed. And not just failed Jews. In many ways, it's failed Black people, it's failed women, it's failed gays. I mean, if you look at the data around a lot of these things, we don't see we still see, Black people are very, very poor compared to white people. We still see women are not earning as much as they should earn. So it's not that DEI has just failed Jews. It's also failed the people in many ways it was supposed to benefit. In fact, the only people who really benefited from these systems are the legions of consultants and nonprofits and manufactured identity-based groups that have profited off of the billions of dollars that have gone into this. Look at Black Lives Matter, the biggest takeaway from the hundreds of millions of dollars that was invested in Black Lives Matter is a multi-million-dollar luxury real estate portfolio by the people who founded it using donations. So that's a whole other topic. But my point is that why is it allowed to happen? Because nobody questioned it. Nobody said, well, what about Jewish people? In fact, when they did, they were shut down. They were silenced. They were accused of white supremacy. So nobody questioned it, number one, because this whole system of identity politics, of DEI, works on mass coercion, silencing, canceling. There's no room for dissent. You can't say, well, I kind of agree with something. Let's talk about it. No, if you don't agree with everything, you're a bad guy. You're canceled. You're gone. So nobody questioned it because they were too scared to. They were silenced. And then talking about our own community, a lot of Jews have basically sat back and been silent over the last year and a half, whether they're scared, whether they don't want to lose business or invitations to fancy parties, whatever. That's their own story. But it also pains me greatly to see so many Jewish people not speaking up. We had Adrian Brody winning an Oscar for playing a Holocaust victim yet again, and he said nothing about anti-Semitism as he was on the biggest stage in the world, benefiting from being a Jew and telling Jewish stories. So in many ways, our own people are not doing their job. And by not doing our job as Jews and saying, this is unacceptable, we will not tolerate it, we are sort of allowing the bad guys to define our narrative for us. And not only that, they know it. They know that there's a vast number of Jews who are timid, afraid, don't know what to do, who are afraid of being called racist, they're afraid of being labeled, white supremacists. It's like the Nazis are at your gates. They're lighting the match to burn down your house, and you're worried about being called a racist. They're not worried about being called a racist. They're not worried about what people think about them. They're ruthless and relentless and bloodthirsty, and they will do whatever it takes to advance their agenda. And you're worried about somebody possibly thinking that you might be a racist and being canceled. Well, it's not going to matter when you're dead. It's not going to matter when your kids can't go to school because they can't get into school because of the protests. It's not going to imagine when you don't have a job because these people have been able to create these lists, these Zionist lists where psychiatrists or authors or actors can't get jobs. Like, none of this will matter, but you're worried about being called a racist. I'm so heartened and so, proud is like not even a word. It's what I use for my kids. It's way more than that. When I see people like you, Brendan, when I see people like Douglas Murray, Richie Torres, like, they're out there and they are defending us, and taking ungodly amounts of shit for it, and yet I see Jew after Jew saying nothing. And it's like history tells us over and over again, nobody is coming to rescue us. Nobody is coming to save us. Yes, America's sending us bombs to Israel and helping us defend ourselves, our Jewish nation. That's great. But at the end of the day, it's still young Jewish boys who have to go and risk their lives and are dying by the hundreds to protect their nation. So this also makes me so frustrated. Like, I do understand, like, as somebody who's African American, I'm also LGBT, I do have an ability to say things that other people can't. But like, I can't do it on my own. Like, I'm not rich. I don't have like vast economic resources to insulate myself from any sort of backlash. I'm lucky that I work at a newspaper that shares this worldview. But if I can do it, there's no reason they can't. And the other side, the pro-Palestinian side, the anti-Zionist side, they are banking on our fear. This is what they're counting on. They're counting on Jews being afraid, Jews being timid, Jews being silent, Jews being scared. This is the most important weapon they have in their arsenal, is Jewish timidity. And what I will say is that Jews have not had very many opportunities to defend themselves because of the way of Jewish history. We saw in the Warsaw Ghetto, but that is not as a historical anomaly. But now we have our own country. We have Jewish soldiers. We have people who are defending. We have Jews who are defending other Jews and willing to risk their lives to defend other Jews. And the way I look at it is that Jews defending Jews is a revolutionary act, and we Jews need to be revolutionaries. Nobody's going to do it for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good potted history of, I guess, one of the great historic shifts of our time, which is the move from what you refer to as Jewish timidity, which for various historical reasons was a fact of life for many Jewish communities, towards the revolutionary situation we find ourselves in now, which is that there is a Jewish homeland and there is a Jewish army and they're willing to fight. I think that's very well put.
One of the reasons they can't, the bad guys, the pro-Pal people, the anti-Zionists, they cannot counter the notion that there are Jewish soldiers willing to die for other Jews. This is so anathema to them. This is what keeps them up at night. They cannot be like Hitler or like the Ukrainians or like the Iberians of centuries past and just come in and kill us. I mean, they did kill us, and we failed, and then we got ourselves together and went back and killed them. But the point is, we will not die willingly as Jews any longer. And, I take great pride in knowing that there are young boys willing to risk. When I'm in Israel, I really have to really honor the fact that I am there because 18-year-old boys, young enough to be my son, barely, or dreaming of going home to their mothers on Shabbat and having, kugel, these boys are willing to die for me, to live as a Jew, free in a Jewish land. That is not a small thing. It is a total historic anomaly, and the people against us cannot stand it.
Hi, it's Brendan here. I want to let you know some exciting news. My new book is out now. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and it's available right now from Amazon. I'm really proud of this book. It is an unflinching account of how the West failed the moral test of 7th of October 2023, which of course is the day that Hamas and other militants invaded Israel and unleashed barbarism. The book documents in chilling detail how activists, academics, and others in the West ended up making excuses for Hamas's violence, ended up taking the side of the pogromists against the pogrom's victims, and ended up, in the process, turning their backs on the values of civilization. The book is fundamentally a call to arms for Western civilization. It makes the case for restoring Enlightenment values and standing with Israel while it's under attack by radical Islamists. I don't know if an author is allowed to describe his own book as essential reading, but I really do think it's essential reading. It's called After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization, and you can get your copy right now on Amazon.
So, David, I wanted to, going back a little bit to something you said earlier, I thought you described very well what you refer to as the original sin of DEI, which is this exclusion of Jews. And I wanted to ask you about that and what that means or what that leads to, because one of the things I wanted to touch on with you is what's been happening on campuses in America over the past year and a half, and campuses in Britain as well and Europe, where there has been so-called pro-Gaza gatherings, which are often just anti-Zionist / anti-Semitic. And so, for example, at Columbia University in New York, we saw some awful scenes of Jewish kids being harassed, and there were placards referring to Israel as the pigs of the earth, and there were chants calling for basically the destruction of the Jewish nation. A return to 1948, i.e. before the modern state of Israel existed. You know, racist stuff is how I would describe it. Jew hatred.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking, we saw this on other campuses as well, and these are the citadels of DEI. These campuses are the places where that ideology really did rule the roost. And I wanted to ask you, is it only that ideology excluded Jews, so it pushed them outside of the realm of progressive concern? They were not allowed to be cared about in the way that other minorities were? Or is it also that it created the Jew as the oppressor class, as the white supremacist? So it actually did include them in a way, but as the force against which everyone else had to rage.
Yeah, I wish it had just excluded Jews and just left Jews alone. That would have been great. That would have been awesome. No, it blamed Jews. It blamed, DEI and all these systems are hierarchical. And more importantly, the E part is not about equality, it's about equity. So this idea that everybody must have the same outcome. And this is actually, so there's two things here. One, it blamed Jews. Jews are the reason, or they're the embodiment of the reasons for this. So the reasons why people of color need DEI is because they have been economically marginalized, they've been politically marginalized, they've been socially marginalized. And that's because of the privileged white people. And the most emblematic example of that in this system are Jews, because they're perceived not only as white, but extremely affluent and successful. And you know what? A lot of Jews are affluent and successful. Great. I wish I was a more affluent and successful Jew, and I welcome the day that will happen to me. But why should we apologize for it? Indian Americans are extremely successful minority in the United States. Nigerian Americans are extremely successful minority in the United States. Chinese Americans, nobody's asking them to apologize, let alone risk violence for it. So DEI, it blamed Jews. It not just excluded them from the system of benefits, it blamed them as the cause. And as I said before, whenever Jews are blamed for something cultural, systemic, governmental, societal, the result of that is always violence. Protests, violence, threats, intimidation, exclusion from the economic systems of earning a living, of education, and then ultimately death. So this is what history says. When you begin to position Jews in this language, it sets up a pattern which ultimately leads to Jewish death. And I think there's a refusal to acknowledge that. They don't understand that. They're playing into a system that has historically led to mass murder. Now, in America, we're not really familiar with that. I mean, as I've written before, even during the height of Jim Crow, the system that existed to exclude African Americans from equal participation in American economy and American government, and following the Civil War, even at the height of Jim Crow, the idea of white supremacy was separate and unequal. The idea was we wanted blacks at their own schools and their own neighborhoods at a much lesser economic level, not participating in government, not participating in the election process, disenfranchisement. But the role of Jim Crow, despite lynching, which existed and is a terrible stain in America's history, but the goal of Jim Crow was not to exterminate black people. It's just to keep them separate and wholly unequal. But the goal of these movements is far more pernicious. The goal of these movements fundamentally is to eradicate and to exterminate Jews. That is their goal. And if you look at everything they say, they ultimately go back to the language of, well, why are they there in the first place? Or why are they this? They use, Jews are white, Jews are this. And every single one of these tropes is to justify violence against Jews in a way that that has never happened against any other minority in American history.
Okay, I want to ask you a couple more questions about how you come at these issues, and you come at them in a way, as I say, that has created great insight, I think, for your readers and observers. But I want to ask you about, I guess, the historical relationship between African Americans and Jews in the United States. So you've written since 7th of October. You've written about you've written a few pieces, basically castigating black activists for adopting what they would refer to as the Palestine cause, but often it's just sympathy for Hamas. And you wrote in Haaretz a piece where you basically said, listen, black American activists, stop doing this. My understanding, and it's a very, very limited understanding, is that there were periods in the 20th century in particular when there was great acts of solidarity between African Americans and Jewish Americans. I mean, the obvious example is the Freedom Rides and the activism that took place in the American South to liberate black communities from Jim Crow laws, etc. And a lot of Jews from the North were involved in that, and they went down and they assisted, and I think that
story died.
Yeah.
Yes,
and that story is quite well known, I think, around the world. So there have been instances of great solidarity, and there have been other instances where that's fallen down, and there's been suspicion and wariness, and so it seems to me to have been a very up and down relationship, but it does seem to have corroded pretty badly since 7th of October. And you've written about African American leftists in particular on the streets making these claims. What is the historical relationship between those two communities? You come from both of those communities, so you will have an insight there.
I mean, first I'll start by saying, why does this get me so, yet another thing that gets me so irate, when I see people, movement mooching, as I call it, aligning the Palestinian struggle with the black struggle, I'm furious. I feel like my history has been kidnapped and hijacked and raped. Because if you look at the African-American struggle for civil rights from the Civil War onward, and also it mirrors the struggle for black rights in South Africa as well. For the most part, these were non-violent movements. The cornerstone of the civil rights movement in America, Martin Luther King, yes, there was Malcolm X and there was extremism, but fundamentally, these were non-violent movements. And this is why they succeeded so dramatically, both in the US and in South Africa. South Africa did have a few examples of terror, but those were the vast exception. So like, for instance, my father and aunt, had to go to they integrated their middle school in 1950 South, and they were like hosed down and sort of, berated and faced violence by white people who were resistant to that happening. So the fundamental tenets of the U.S. civil rights movement is nonviolence. The fundamental tenet of Palestinian liberation is violence. The cornerstone of everything they do centers around the killing of Jews or Jewish-related individuals. So when I see Black people saying that we share so much history, we share so much struggle, I'm just like, fuck you, people. Give me back my history. This is factually, philosophically, and morally incorrect. And I, as somebody who's African American and whose own family, my father and his siblings, were on the front lines of integrating schools, I'm offended by it. I'm horrified by it. And I'm horrified by the fact that it's historically inaccurate, but it's morally inaccurate. So I start from there by saying, give me back my history, stop hijacking it, stop kidnapping, work harder, people. That's number one. Number two, yes, we have seen many examples of strong Jewish and Black alliances throughout history, hence my parents. I'm happy they were aligned, or else I wouldn't be alive right now. They weren't aligned very long, but long enough for me to be born. My point is, and that's great, but I'm also a little bit weary of that. When I hear people sort of hearkening back to these great Jewish and Black alliances, I feel like I'm in my living room when I was 9 or something like that. And part of the reason why I get frustrated by that is that we're talking about history 50 years ago, and we need to be talking about history now. We talk about now. Now the problem is now. Now we see people marching through the streets. Now we see Jews trapped in Hamas terror tunnels for over 500 days, possibly horrible things, the most unimaginable things happening to them. They're so bad, we can't even imagine what's happening to them, So I don't really care about 50 years ago. I care about now. But the biggest problem I have with this way of speaking is two things. One, it feeds into what I call Israel erasure, which is an attempt by Jews or Jewish aligned movements in America to sort of discuss anti-Semitism, discuss what's happening now on campuses, and somehow sort of skirt Israel to the side and saying, well, if we don't talk about Israel, we can find a solution. Israel's the problem. No, the problem isn't Israel. The problem is that people hate Jews. People have hated Jews long before Israel was around. There was no Israel in 1939. There was no Israel in 1492. So the issue of Israel erasure as a Zionist is very concerning to me. But number two, I feel like this idea of celebrating long-standing allegiances, alliances just isn't effective. And in fact, I actually think it makes it worse. If you were to tell young Black students marching on campus or in some sort of conscious raising group that, oh my God, you have so much in common with young Jewish students, they're just going to be like, fuck you, what are you talking about? In fact, they're going to use that as proof of the insidiousness of the Jews with their fingers and everything. No, instead of saying to young Black kids in America, it's also not really true. The average Black American is far less economically stable than the average Jewish American. In many ways, Blacks and Jews in America don't have a lot in common anymore and have never had less in common before. But so what? That's not my point. My point is, if I was running these organizations, what I would say is, instead of focusing all this energy and money and programs to sort of convince young Black people that they have so much in common with Jews, we need to be convincing young Black kids that they have nothing in common with Hamas. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be convincing young LGBTs and the queers from Palestine that they have nothing in common with Hamas. In fact, everything that they believe in is derailed, is denied by Hamas. They are the antithesis of anything you stand for. There's nothing progressive. There's nothing revolutionary. There's nothing resisting about Hamas. They are fundamentalists, Islamists, mass murderers committed to the destruction of Jews, Westerners, the subjugation of women, and the mass murder of gay people. So that's what we need to be focusing our energy on. I don't care about what happened 50 years ago. I'm happy that Jews and Blacks aligned in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I'm happy my parents met. I'm happy these movements took place and flourished. I am concerned about making sure that young Black kids in America understand that their interests, their history, their beliefs, their ideologies are diametrically opposed to Hamas. And one last thing I will say is that it's interesting. You see protests against Israel and Jews all across America, but where do you not see protests against Israel and Jews on campuses? You do not see them on historically Black colleges. Historically Black colleges where my grandparents met, for instance, on a historically Black college in Texas. My niece goes to a historically Black college. So these are very important institutions. You do not see mass protests against Israel on historically Black colleges. Now, the New York Times, in their New York Times way, tried to say, well, it's because they're such venerable institutions, a historic institution, and the Black kids that go there understand sort of the weight of the responsibility of being there and respecting their parents and legacies. No, you do not see anti-Israel or anti-Zionist protests on Black universities and colleges because there are no Jews there. That's why. There's no Jews on a college campus. There's no need to protest against Israel because ultimately this is all about intimidating Jews and making them feel unwelcome and imperiled.
Right. I want to ask you a little bit more about Israel erasure, as you described it there, because I think that's really interesting insight, that you have a situation where there will be some Jewish representatives in the United States and maybe in Europe as well who want to talk about these problems, but kind of push Israel to one side. The kind of it's a bit of an embarrassment. We don't really want to talk about Israel. And I completely agree with you that if anything, that makes things even worse. But it touches on something you said earlier, where you said that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's a new form of, or it's the current expression of anti-Semitism. And I really wanted to ask you about that. I agree. And it seems to me that, you know, even if you see a demonstration these days, which does seem more anti-Israel than just kind of Jew baiting, you know, I mean, who knows how to distinguish these things, but you might see a protest that is just very much against Israel's military actions in Gaza. But even there, you will often see Israel being discussed in a way that other states just aren't talked about. It's seen as a bloodlusting nation, a uniquely murderous nation. That's how it is referred to by commentators here in Britain. It's seen as an unusually barbaric nation. And it does often seem to me, as someone who is not Jewish and not African American, but who's very interested in these things, it does seem to me that a lot of the stuff that used to be expressly said about the Jewish people now is often said about the Jewish nation, but it is similar in terms of what's being said.
I mean, the issue of Israel erasure for me is much more concerning because I see it amongst Jews. That's what's concerning for me. I mean, it goes back to sort of what Ilhan Omar said when she was touring Colombia, where she was talking about like the good Jews and the genocidal Jews, you know. But at the end of the day, we're all Jews. That's the point. That's what people don't seem to understand. And what's so frustrating to me is like I've never seen an American minority that is so willing to turn against its own people. You know, like you would never see Black people sort of turning against Blacks during the height of Black Lives Matter, or LGBTs turning against, like, that's not necessarily true. During the AIDS crisis, you did see some gay activists turning against their own. That was an exception. But, you know, generally you don't see minority groups in America turning against themselves at their most imperiled moment. Yet Jews have actually done that right now in the United States and around the world. And this ties in, again, to what I'm calling the Israel erasure, because there's this idea that, well, we're Jews, we're not Zionists, or we support, you know, our Jewish collective, our Jewish community, but we don't support Israel. You know, what about Netanyahu? What about the West Bank? Blah, 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 blah. All of these things are, of course, very important. But Netanyahu did not cause Islamic fundamentalism. You know, that's been around since the 7th century, long before Netanyahu was alive. You know, so there's this idea amongst, again, this concerns me more amongst Jews than non-Jews, because my whole viewpoint is that we are the first defense against our own eradication, is when I see Jews sort of having this belief that they can opt out of anti-Semitism. They can opt out of being part of the Jewish nation. If they say the right things or do the right things, you know, they're going to be the good Jews versus the bad Jews. No, 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 no. It doesn't work like that, people. Now, it goes back to what I was saying. Why do I know it doesn't work like that? Because I'm also Black. I know that racism, no Black person, no matter how assimilated, no matter how wealthy or how quote unquote light-skinned, no Black person will ever think that they can opt out of racism in America. They know it's bigger than them. They know it's beyond them. They know it's a system that that has nothing necessarily to even do with them. This is part of the way the world works. But yet you have Jews who are thinking, well, if I only do this or say this or wear the right pin or go to the right meeting or align myself with the right causes, I will be considered one of the good Jews. You will not be considered one of the good Jews, Mr. Jewish person. When the Hamas people come, they will still kill you. When the bad guys come and want to line you up and shoot you, they will still shoot you. We saw it in the Holocaust. There were no exceptions. There were no exception cards for like the good Jews during in Germany in 1939, 1945. No, the mandate was to kill all Jews, because the problem that the people have against us is that we are Jewish. This is their beef with us. this is what they don't like. So it's very easy to say, well, if we disassociate ourselves from Israel, if we disassociate ourselves from Zionism, we will be exempt from these repercussions. But you are wrong. When I see these folks who are leading these anti-Zionist Jewish groups, all I can say is that when Hamas comes to your door to kill you, the first thing they will say is, thank you for your service, and then they will kill you. But they will still kill you. I wrote a piece for the Jerusalem Post talking about house slaves and field slaves during the era of slavery before the Civil War. And it's like, these folks, I recall, they're sort of like the house slaves of the Jewish nation. They think that their supposed privilege and protection by some who knows what master will protect them from the forces of evil that are against them. But as I wrote in that piece, at the end of the day, house slaves and field slaves were all still slaves. They had no freedoms. And the same thing with Jews. Like, we are all one people. And the people who are committed to our eradication do not care about our individual beliefs. The only thing they care about is that we are Jews.
So, David, my last question for you is on, I guess, what happens next. And you've given a really good outline there of the depth of this problem and the seriousness of it. And as I was saying, it's what you're saying applies in different ways to Europe as well as to America, because we have serious problems here as well in the post-7th October moment. So I guess what happens next? So we started off by talking about the new Trump era and the reckoning America is having with itself. One of the discussions I'm seeing at the moment, and I'm following it with keen interest, is the question of, is wokeness dead, or is it just taking a bit of a beating?
In hibernation.
In hibernation, and I guess because a lot of the current forms of anti-Semitism spring in various ways from so-called wokeness and from the DEI ideology and intersectionality and the idea that Jews are white supremacists, etc. This pertains to what we're talking about, because if wokeness is on its last legs, there might be hope from some of the problems you've just been talking about. So I guess the question is, how optimistic do you feel that this reckoning America is having with its institutions and its ideologies will do something quite real to tackle the problem of anti-Semitism as it has manifested itself over the past 16 months?
Yeah, I mean, again, Donald Trump is an extremely problematic president and leader. But when it comes to this issue, I say, what took him so long? I do feel like what my hope here, again, my thinking is always rooted back into my own community. I want Jews. I want Jews to protect Jews. I want Jews to stand up for Jews. We cannot rely on anybody to take care of us. So my hope is that this atmosphere that Donald Trump is cultivating right now, he's cultivating an atmosphere that says anti-Semitism, institutional anti-Semitism will no longer be allowed. It is just unacceptable and will be prosecuted. One of the big issues we had during the previous administration is, particularly in liberal-run cities like New York, is that there's no prosecution, there's no accountability. People can do whatever the fuck they want, and nobody, there's no consequence. Donald Trump is saying that there will be consequences for institutionalized, organized anti-Semitism, and those consequences will be in accordance with the similar consequences for racism or other forms of discrimination. So he's very clearly saying that. So what is my hope? My hope, as this rolls out, that Jews themselves will begin to have more confidence, will begin to have more. One of the reasons why I think maybe a lot of Jews have been very quiet over the last 16 months is they don't believe that the system will protect them. So maybe now they see from the top somebody saying, we are going to protect you. We understand. We believe you. There's so much language amongst woke ideology. Believe Black women, believe trans people, believe this, believe that. Nobody believes Jewish people when they say, we can't go into our class because there are crazy pro-Palestinian mobs barricading it, and it's on TV, and still no one believes them. So maybe now what Donald Trump is saying, I believe you. So if we know that from the top that we are being believed, my hope, and I think this could happen, is that more of us will have the courage or the confidence. I'm not saying Jews are not courageous. We are courageous. I mean, we're still around after all these years. But we'll have the confidence and security to actually say, we are not going to take it anymore. We are not going to tolerate it. The police or whatever, the government says that they're going to defend us. We are going to make sure that they actually do and hold them accountable. So that's my hope. Again, like I don't see some Gentile savior, riding on a horse coming to rescue us. We have to rescue ourselves. And my hope is that Donald Trump and the current administration, by saying that we take your situation very seriously, we believe you, will instill in Jews themselves to have the confidence, to have the security, to have the omets, as we say in Hebrew, to demand that this moment, the tsunami of anti-Semitism ends, and that the folks who are imperiling us are arrested, sent to jail, or kicked out of the country and sent back to wherever the fuck they came from.
David, thank you very much.
Thank you.